All right, so I'll elaborate more about my, I don't know what to call it, disappointment from this whole sugya next week, not this week. Not going to get to you. I'll try to finish on a more positive note. So, hadlakat nerot, why? Says the Tanchuma, minayin shechayav adam liot zeir v'zarid b'adlakat ner b'Shabbat, sheneimar v'karat Shabbat oneg zod adlakat ner b'Shabbat. So, this seems to indicate oneg Shabbat, right? Oneg Shabbat could be derived from adlakat nerot. That's one aspect. In the Psikta it says, Kabbalat ala Yisrael b'yemei Moshe Rabbeinu adlik haner. Chachamim omrim, mitzvah להדליק מפני שלום ביתו, ושלא יבוא אדם לידי חילול שבת, ולידי חילול מזיד, כגון שהוא צריכה לו נר לחולה ולחיה, ועוד משום שלא יאכל בחושך. So, 3 reasons, I think. Number 1, Shlom Beito. What is Shlom Beito? What does that mean?
Maybe that you won't bump into things and bump into each other and start fighting.
Right. So what Yaakov's saying, it's funny because I think most people nowadays, when they read this, right, they like quoting. We started Kislev yesterday, right? So you can talk about Hanukkah already, right? The last Rambam in Chot Chanukah says that you should prefer, and based on the Gemara in Masal Shabbat, we're going to see in a moment, you should prefer buying Shabbos candles to buying Hanukkah candles. If you could only buy one, right, you only have enough candles for Shabbos, not for both, or for one or the other. You should preferably use them for Shabbos candles, as in meaning candles that you could use, and not Hanukkah candles, as in candles you're not allowed to use, right? And you're not allowed to use. You're not allowed to benefit from the Hanukkah candles. You're supposed to benefit from the Shabbos candles. So you should benefit from those candles, not benefit from those candles, because of Shlom Bayit and Gadol Shalom, which teaches us, the Rambam writes, the Rambam explicates, Gadol Shalom, right? Shalom is a very important thing, such an important thing that you're going to prefer these candles to be used and not to be used. Now, I think very anachronistically, people read this Rambam and say, if you come home or whatever, if you're home and your wife doesn't light the Shabbos candles, so oy vavoy, right? And that's not what the Rambam is talking about. He's talking about it's going to be dark. You're not going to be able to, and when it's dark, it's going to be really dark. You're not going to be able to have a proper Shabbos meal. I remember whatever specifically now jump into my mind, right, where there was a blackout and we had the Shabbos candles, the blackout on Leil Shabbat, and it created a lot of tension amongst the kids, etc. I remember it became very, very tense, very, very fast. That's just what happens when it's very dark. I don't think it's not Shlom Bayit, like, make sure your wife lights the candles. It's in our world, and this is something we're gonna have to go deeper into the rest of the sugya next time. In our world, the lighting, the extent of light that we have in our houses is something that people in the Middle Ages could only dream of. It's not like we need to read some history. I've read up some about this, about the history of lighting. It's unbelievable. It's just a whole world. The lighting we have is something that's unparalleled in the Middle Ages, which is when the Rambam was talking, the Rishonim are talking, definitely when the Gemara is talking. It's something that, and when we say that every candle helps, in their world, every candle really helped. In our world, it's very, very hard to say that. In our world, it's not, you have a well-lit room, it's a well-lit room. You had another candle, no one sees anything, right? No one sees the difference in terms of the lighting. We have very, very good lighting, very effective lighting. Such good lighting, I turn the lights off behind me so it won't disturb the camera, because the room is so well lit that you won't be able to see me. You'll only see the light all around me if I leave all the lights on. That's what we're used to, right? So just a few words about Shlom Bayit. I think the pshat of Shlom Bayit was what Yaakov said. I'll show that from over here. it says over here, "Vatiznach mishalom nafshi nashidi tova," which is a very extreme pasuk, right? It's from Eicha. That's a pretty terrible. Eicha Gimel is a pretty terrible chapter. One of the worst chapters. Almost was terrible in terms of the terror, right? One of the most terrible chapters in the whole Tanakh. Mamash. It's like, it's bad news. But if you don't have a Shabbos candle, so you're in trouble. That's pretty extreme. This connection. And Rashi writes that now, on Shabbos you can't add any more light. You have to have a Suda at night. It's a very problematic time. You have to have a Suda at night, which is something that people didn't necessarily, poor people, right? The Gemara at the beginning of Brachot says, poor people didn't eat at night. Right? The Gemara at the beginning of Brachot, when it tries to figure out the time, right, works out the times, exactly how early can you daven Shema? Can you say Shema? Right? So the Gemara in Brachot says, well, poor people rush home when it's, they want to utilize the light hours for work, but they have to eat when there's some light out because they can't eat in the dark because they're poor. Right? Why not? Because they don't have money to start lighting candles. Now, on Shabbos you can't light more candles, and many people weren't used to eating at night at all. They'd eat as early as they can in the evening, so it won't be too dark. Now on Shabbos, many times you had to eat after dark, normally, right? So you have to have a Shabbos candle. Otherwise, things get very tense very fast, right? That's the Pashtud, that's a Shlom Bayit issue. That's what we mean when we say Shlom Bayit in terms of Shabbat. The opposite is Vatiznach mishalom nafshi, which is pretty terrible if you see the context there. I mean, it's some tubabo chayai vayadu even bi. I mean, that's the psukim there are pretty intense. Anyway, back to, so that's number one, the Shlom Bayit. Number two, so what's the other solution? If you have a Shlom Bayit, right, things are getting tense, what happens? Someone's going to just turn the light on. Now, you might turn the light on without thinking, which is the first option here. Second option, he says, no, we can cope without the light. What happens if something does happen? Someone gets sick, or a woman's giving birth. Better news, but more complex, right? So now you need a candle. Someone has to light this candle. So again, is it Chilul Shabbat again? Chilul Mazid here doesn't mean that you chayav skila kod Chilul Mazid. Chilul Mazid here means you're going to be pushed into a corner. You're going to have to turn some light. You're going to need light. You're going to need light because someone's going to be sick or someone's not going to feel well because something. Now, maybe it's not Chilul Shabbat technically, but you should definitely be prepared in advance. That's the second issue. Why shelo yochal b'choshech? Why is that so important? So it's interesting. Machloket Rashi and Tosfot. Rashi writes, "Kavod Shabbat hu she'en seuda chashuva ela b'makom me'or ke'en yimama." Rashi says, eating in the dark or without sufficient light isn't Kavod Shabbat. Here, this Rashi too, I think people often anachronize this, if that's a word, this Rashi as well. Right? And they say, whenever you go to a nice restaurant, there are always candles on the table, right? So that's Kavod Shabbat, right? Is that what Rashi's talking about? I don't think Rashi's talking about that. I think Rashi means eating in the dark. It's not that, every romantic meal has to have candles, right? It's a candlelit meal. That's a serious Suda, right? I don't think that's Rashi's talking about. I think Rashi's talking about serious people don't eat in the dark. Respectable people don't eat in the dark. They make sure there's sufficient light. So Rashi says Kavod Shabbat because otherwise it's disrespectful for Shabbat to not have candles or sufficient light, as I said. Tosfot say b'Shabbat chova pirush b'mkom suda the chova sheisod b'mkom haner mishum oneg. Tosfot say it's oneg Shabbat. right? So basically, the machloket is when you make sure to have sufficient light or to light the candles at the where you eat. Is that for Shabbos or is that for you, right? Kavod Shabbat means it's disrespectful to Shabbos if you don't. Oneg Shabbat means you won't enjoy, I mean for you, but for you for Shabbat. Oneg Shabbat means that you won't enjoy your Seudah if you won't have light. See how Shibboleth writes this very poetically, I'd say. Ein svia el b'marit ayin. Once again, right? He says if you don't see your food, you don't enjoy it, right? וכן קהלת אמר, טוב מראה עיניים מהלוך נפש, וכן אמרו רבותינו לא יאכל אדם תבשילו אלא לאור הנר. Again, so if you're all we're gonna finish very shortly, don't worry, and any of you haven't eaten supper, make sure to light a candle before you eat, right? Right? That's not what he means, right? He means if you can't eat in the dark, it's not gonna be, you'll end up eating a fly, I don't know, you're gonna, right? Hasumin ochlim veinan sveim. Another, I don't know if it's a proverb or something, right? Right? Blind people never really enjoy their food. Mishochlim b'Shabbat belo ner b'choshech idamu, which is funny because it's not b'choshech idamu. They literally are in choshech, right? Tov, ki inan ochlim lasov nafsham, ועוד שמייפול זבוב במאכל או שום דבר איסור ואינו רואה. לפיכך אמרו רבותינו הדלקת נר בשבת חובה כדי שיתענג בשבת במאכל ובמשתה. So you have to eat where you have to have candles lit where you're eating, otherwise you won't enjoy your food. Now, but again, the emphasis here is you won't see anything. You have to see your food to enjoy it, right? So, just to sum up what we've had, right? The Tanchuma here mentions oneg, which has to do with the way Tosfot explained oneg in the context of the Seudah. Shibboleth explains what is oneg in the context of Seudah. It means you have to see what you're eating, otherwise you don't enjoy it. That's number one. Number two is shlom bayit. Shlom bayit, we said you have to have light, otherwise things get tense. Otherwise, it's not a good thing. Now, it might be specifically in the context of Shabbat, you need more shlom bayit because everyone's home, everyone's together, and you're eating in the dark, right? As opposed to during the week where you could just make sure to eat earlier or light a candle later, right? Shabbat, you have that problem, so you have to make sure that Shabbat doesn't become something bad, right? Something that causes more tension. This connects, obviously, as I said before, right, to the Gemara and the Rashi over here about Shlom Bayit, right, that whole story. The other thing we saw was Lo yavo adam yechul Shabbat. You have to make sure there's light because you never know what you're going to need it for. So now let's see, as usual, let's see the Rambam. The Rambam writes this twice. Number one, Perkei, הדלקת נר בשבת אינה רשות, אם רצה מדליק ואם רצה אינו מדליק, ולא מצווה שאינו חייב לרדוף אחריה עד שיעשנה, like עירוב תבשילין או נטילת ידיים לאכילה. So הדלקת נר is not something you can do, it's not something you should do, it's something you must do, right? אינה רשות, it's not just like a good idea, right? It's not, and it's not a mitzvah, an elective mitzvah, I'd say. It's chova, right? אחד אנשים ואחד נשים חייבים לבתיהן נר דלוק בשבת, אפילו אין לו מה יאכל. שואל הפתחים ולוקח שמן ומדליק את הנר, שזה בכלל עונג שבת. So, candlelight according to the Rambam is part of what mitzvah? עונג Shabbat. I can read your lips, Dr. Ellis. We didn't hear you, but I can read your lips. The Rambam in Perek Lamed, right, chapter 30, 25 chapters later, the Rambam writes, מסדר אדם שולחנו בערב שבת, אף על פי שאינו צריך אלא לכזית, וצריך לתקן ביתו מבעוד יום מפני כבוד השבת, ויהיה נר דלוק ושולחן ערוך ומיטה מוצת, שכל אלו לכבוד שבת הן. So, you light the candles as part of כבוד Shabbat. Thank you. It's great how you could continue without unmuting yourself. Right, very good. So is it Onik Shabbat or Kvod Shabbat? So I'll very briefly say the two answers that I brought here. I'll start with the Beit Halevi. Beit Halevi says the following. He says, Beit Halevi has a rule. It's a very cool rule. I like it. He says like this: Kavod Shabbat is everything that happens before Shabbat. Oneg Shabbat is everything that happens on Shabbat. You can't have Oneg Shabbat before Shabbat, right? And Kavod Shabbat, primarily at least, applies to everything that happens as you prepare for Shabbat, right? The way to respect someone who's coming, a special visitor, is to prepare in advance. So Kavod Shabbat is everything that happens before Shabbat, and therefore that's what he says. Mesader adam shulchano be'erev Shabbat, etc. It says everything. Right? Everything that has to happen before Shabbat is Kavod Shabbat. So lighting the candle before Shabbat is part of Kavod Shabbat. As opposed to Oneg Shabbat is the existence of the candle on Shabbos is Oneg Shabbat. So the action of lighting the candle that happens on Friday is Kavod Shabbat. That's your way of respecting Shabbat. The candle being lit on Shabbat is Oneg Shabbat. Now, this assumes something that's not so clear in the Rambam. I'll just point this out. Chayavim liot bevatehen ner deluk b'Shabbat. Question: who lit that candle? Chayavim liot bevatehen ner deluk b'Shabbat. Who lit the candle? As Dr. Ellis is saying, nobody knows. It's there. You have to make sure it's there, but it's there. Could the guy do it? Right? It just has to be there, right? Even over here, so here you can say, so that's Oneg Shabbat. Oneg Shabbat is the fact that it's existence, right? Kavod Shabbat is that you prepared for it. But you see, it says, V'yihyeh ner deluk. It's very interesting that the Rambam starts with, Mesader shulchano, who? You. Tzarich letaken beito, who? You. V'yihyeh ner deluk. Who did that? I don't know. It's just there, right? Just interesting that the Rambam goes out of his way to change the what do you call it? What's it called? The goof. Dr. Ellis is going to save me again. Or he won't. Why?
Case, I think.
To change
Case.
that?
Case.
Case? Is that
No,
it?
the verb, conjugation.
Conjugation.
Person, you're trying to say.
The person.
Person.
Yes. The person, as it were.
Yaakov has a better word. Yaakov was about to say.
Rabbi Yoel says that you're right.
But also your shulchan is suddenly aruch. Maybe part of Mesader Adam Shulchano is the Ner and the Shulchan Aruch.
Right. So it's interesting, right? Shulchan Aruch means the way Shabbos starts to be with Shulchan Aruch, but who did it? It says over there. As opposed to Ner, it doesn't say who lit the candle.
The Ner is on your table.
Okay, but who put
Maybe
it?
It's together. I don't know.
Yeah, but it should have said Mesader Shulchan Aruch Shabbat Madlik Rav Ner. It's interesting that the Rambam never says you need to actively light the candle. Just keep that in mind. We're going to get back to this later on. But that's Beis Halevi says, Oneg Shabbat is the existence of the candle on Shabbat. Kavod Shabbat is that you prepared the candle in advance. Did you actually light the candle? The Rambam never actually says that, which is a bit strange in the context of, if you want to say the distinction, the voice, passive or active, okay, right, passive or active voices, okay? It's interesting that the Rambam never explicitly says you light the candle, especially if the main distinction is it the existence of the candle as opposed to the action of making sure that the candle is there. So that's Beit Halevi. Aruch HaShulchan says like this, he says, you're reading this wrong. He says, what is the topic of, what is the topic over here? The topic over here is the Seudat Shabbat, is how to get to a good Seudat Shabbat. Right? You have to set the table. Now you'll say Mita Mutzat, but bear in mind, Mita Mutzat in their days was preparing the couches that surrounded your table. That's what Mita Mutzat means in their context. It's not making your bed. they didn't have quite as much furniture as we had. Mitamutzat means preparing them to be conveniently sitting, right? Convenient for sitting. That's what it means. So the whole context here is the seudah, which means it's like Rashi said, that Kvod Shabbat, the candles, the aspect of Kvod Shabbat in the candles is having them as part of your seudah. As opposed to here is a broader thing of having it around in the rest of the rooms, Shlom Bayit. So he says the context of Perek Hey is Shlom Bayit. The context of Perek Lamed is seudah. And therefore, he's like he's holding like Rashi. It's kind of the opposite of the Beit Halevi in that sense, right? Kind of the opposite, but more different than this opposite. Where the issue in Perek Lamed is how you prepare how you mechabed, how you have proper respect for your Seudat Shabbat, by having a candle, by having a table set, etc. As opposed to Perek Hey, it's the more of a Shlom Bayit, Shloi Kashel issue.